July 2nd, 1943. The skies above Castelvetrano, Sicily, tremble under the roar of engines. A German FW-190 dives, hunting the American bombers crossing the Mediterranean. From above, a lone P-40 Warhawk drops into a steep descent. Its pilot, Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, 22 years old, from Brazil, Indiana, pulls the trigger. A burst of .50 caliber rounds tears through the German fuselage. Black smoke erupts. The FW-190 spirals, then plunges into the parched Sicilian fields. That afternoon, a single kill mark was painted beneath Hall's cockpit, the first victory ever achieved by a black American pilot. Months later, over the beaches of Anzio, Italy, January 27, 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron still flew their aging P-40s, holding formation against faster, deadlier FW-190s. They returned battered, but together. A report recommending their removal from combat was quietly withdrawn. By the summer of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group received the P-51 Mustang. Their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., gave a single order: do not lose a single bomber. From Italy to Berlin, they flew 179 escort missions, claimed 112 enemy kills, and recorded the lowest bomber loss rate in the entire 15th Air Force. The Germans once mocked them, but between 1943 and 1945, over the skies of Europe, they learned, through fire and numbers, how wrong they were. July 2nd, 1943. Castelvetrano Airfield, Sicily. The Mediterranean sun turns the steel of the runways into shimmering white. Above it, the air vibrates with the sound of war. A German FW-190 climbs through the haze. Its pilot scans the horizon, never seeing the danger descending from the blinding light above. Cut to cockpit view, oxygen mask breathing. From 12 o'clock high, a P-40 Warhawk dives, tracers flashing, shells rip through the German fuselage. The FW-190 rolls once, then plunges into the Sicilian countryside. On the ground, technicians run from their tents, staring into the sky. The kill belongs to Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, 22 years old, from Brazil, Indiana, the first black pilot in American history to shoot down an enemy fighter. That victory would mark the beginning of something no one in Germany or America believed possible. In Nazi Germany, racial theory was law. The Nuremberg laws classified black people as Untermensch, subhuman. They were deemed incapable of mastering complex machines, unfit for combat, unworthy of respect. But that ideology was about to be tested by men who had fought prejudice long before they fought the Luftwaffe. Across the Atlantic in Tuskegee, Alabama, a quiet experiment was underway. An experiment born from political pressure and moral contradiction. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College had released a report titled Employment of Negro Manpower in War. It stated coldly, compared to the white man, he is of inferior mentality and weak in character. That was official policy. The American military believed black men could not lead, could not fly, and could not face combat. Yet throughout the 1930s, individuals proved otherwise. Eugene Bullard, denied by America, had already flown for France in World War I. Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license in France when no U.S. school would take her. The Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago trained dozens of black pilots, proving skill knew no color. Civil rights leaders, Walter White, A. Philip Randolph, Judge William H. Hastie, pressed Washington relentlessly. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier hammered one question: how can America fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home? April 3, 1939. Congress passes Public Law 18. Hidden within its clauses, a requirement that one or more civilian pilot schools train black students. A small crack in a steel door. 2 years later, in January 1941, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson announces the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black unit stationed at Tuskegee Army Airfield. The official statement calls it an experiment. To many, it was a trap and designed to prove failure. To the men at Tuskegee, it was a doorway to the skies. Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., the son of America's first black general. At West Point, he spent 4 years in silence. No white cadet spoke to him except on official business. No one sat with him in the mess hall. No one shared a room. He graduated without ever hearing a friend's voice. And when he was asked how he endured, he replied, "I just decided to be better than they were." In 1943, Davis took command of the 99th Squadron. He knew every mission would be a test, not of tactics, but of existence itself. April 1943. The 99th arrives in Tunisia, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William Momyer, a commander who made no secret of his disbelief in black pilots. He assigned them minor patrols over the Mediterranean. No fighter sweeps, no escort missions, just flights designed to keep them away from combat. June 2nd, 1943. Their first combat mission, an attack on the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. German fighters appeared out of the sun. The Tuskegee pilots held formation, shielding their bombers. No aircraft were lost on either side. But the Germans learned a lesson that day. These men did not break. July 2nd, 1943, Castelvetrano. Hall's 8th mission. 2 FW-19s descend on the B-25 formation. Hall turns inside their attack path, firing a long burst. The second German fighter shudders, spins, and plunges into the ground. When he lands, the entire base erupts. Black ground crews who had endured months of insults finally had proof no one could deny. A black American had just destroyed a German ace. The news spread quietly through the ranks. To the men of Tuskegee, it was not just a kill. It was the first crack in America's own wall. By January 1944, the 99th had fought for 7 months. Their record was solid, yet Colonel Momyer filed a scathing report to headquarters. The unit lacks aggressiveness and should be removed from combat. The report reached General Henry Hap Arnold. He was ready to end the Tuskegee experiment. Then came Anzio. January 27, 1944, the Allies landed Anzio. 15 pilots of the 99th take off in obsolete P-40s to intercept German raiders. Against superior FW-19s, they fight furiously. 2 days of dogfights. By the end, sources vary. Between 8 and 13 enemy planes downed. Captain Charles Hall scores 2 more victories. The results shatter Mommier's report. The War Department orders a study comparing the 99th with white P-40 units. The finding, equal or better performance under similar conditions. The Tuskegee Airmen had proved they belonged. May 1944, the 99th joins the 100th, 301st, and 302nd to form the 332nd Fighter Group under Colonel Davis. Their new mission, escort heavy bombers deep into Germany for the 15th Air Force. Before departure, Davis gathers his pilots and speaks. "Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." Weeks later, General Nathan Twining orders color identifiers for fighter groups. The 332nd receives red. They paint the entire tail crimson, a symbol that would soon terrify German pilots and inspire American crews. From then on, bomber crews had one request. If you can get them, get the red tails. Summer 1944. Davis leads 66 Mustangs on a mission to Memmingen, Germany. The bombers are late. He makes a decision that would define the unit's ethos: stay and wait in enemy territory. When the bombers arrive, so do 100 German fighters. A storm of metal erupts. The 332nd claims a dozen kills but loses 3 pilots. 15 bombers fall. Critics seize on the losses, but investigations reveal the truth. The Red Tails had prevented a massacre. From then on, no one questioned their courage. Tuskegee training had been merciless. Pilots flew 300 hours instead of 200, double the discipline. 60% washed out. Those who remained became the most selective group in the Army Air Forces. They learned to fly in tight formation, to move as one. That discipline would become their shield over Europe. By mid-1944, Germany's air defense was desperate. Fuel was scarce, pilots younger and less trained. But the Red Tails faced a different enemy: skepticism. Each mission was a test not just against the Luftwaffe, but against a country watching to see if they would fail. And yet, with every sortie, every bomber brought home, the math changed. Their escort loss rate, 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters. The average for other groups, 46. Numbers don't argue, they simply record truth. By early 1944, the war in Italy had turned into a brutal stalemate. German forces clung to the mountain ridges south of Rome. From the air, the landscape looked peaceful. Olive trees, stone villages, winding roads. But every field hid artillery, and every hill concealed a gun. At Ramatelli Airfield, the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron received new orders. Escort the Anzio landings. 15 pilots prepared to take off in their worn-out P-40 Warhawks, the same aircraft other units had already retired. Their engines coughed in protest, then roared to life. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. walked the flight line, helmet under his arm. He said little. His calm was discipline carved by years of silence. Every man watching him understood what was at stake. January 27, 1944. The sky above Anzio filled with smoke and contrails. German FW-190s dove in pairs, attacking Allied shipping near the beachhead. The 99th climbed to intercept. Radio static cracked. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. What followed lasted minutes but felt eternal. Lieutenant Charles Hall spotted 2 enemy fighters breaking formation. He pulled into a steep climb, rolled, and fired a burst. A flash, black smoke, 1 FW-190 falling in flames. All around him, the air became a web of crossing lines and tracer fire. When it was over, at least 8 German aircraft had been destroyed. The Tuskegee Airmen returned to base exhausted but triumphant. In Washington, reports arrived quickly. General Arnold rescinded the order to disband the squadron. The 99th had proven its worth in the most undeniable way, through combat. 2 months later, in May 1944, the Air Force reorganized. 4 all-black squadrons, the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd, merged into a single unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. At their new base in southern Italy, ground crews worked day and night painting fresh markings on their P-51 Mustangs. Red spinners, red bands, red tails. The color was more than decoration. It was identity. One mechanic joked, "Let them see us coming." Another replied, "They already do." From that moment, every bomber crew flying out of the 15th Air Force would recognize their guardians instantly. The Germans would give them a name that carried both mockery and fear. Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. Before their first major escort, Colonel Davis addressed his pilots. "Our job is not glory, it is responsibility. We are not here to hunt kills. We are here to bring the bombers home." He pointed at the map. Routes to Munich, Vienna, Ploiești, Berlin. Long, thin lines across enemy territory. These were not short patrols. Each mission meant 6 hours in the cockpit, oxygen mask freezing, hands numb, minds razor sharp. Discipline became doctrine. Stay in formation. Never abandon the bombers. To break rank was to break the trust of men depending on you for their lives. June 9th, 1944. 64 P-51 Mustangs lifted from Ramatelli, bound for Munich. The silver bombers they escorted, B-17 Flying Fortresses, climbed slowly, heavy with payload. At altitude, the red tails fanned out into 3 defensive layers. Close escort, weaving directly above the bombers. Medium escort, intercepting threats before they reached the formation. High escort, watching for enemy dives from the sun. When the first German fighters appeared, the formation held. 2 Me-19s tried to break through the top layer. They never returned. After 6 hours, all bombers landed safely. 0 losses. One of the crewmen wrote in his log, "They never left us, not once." July 18th, 1944. Target, the Luftwaffe base at Memmingen, Germany. 66 Red Tails under Davis take off to meet the bombers. But the bombers are late. Fuel ticks down. Returning to base would mean abandoning the mission and their word. Davis makes his choice. We hold position. Minutes become an hour. Then dots appear in the distance. Not bombers, but enemy fighters. Nearly 100 German aircraft attacking from every angle. The sky turns into chaos. Streaks of metal, bursts of flame, wings snapping midair. Pilots shout coordinates. Radios scream with overlapping voices. In 20 minutes, 15 bombers are lost, 3 Red Tails shot down, but they never broke formation. Even as ammunition ran low, They shielded the bombers until the last group crossed into Allied airspace. After landing, Davis wrote only one line in his log: "We stayed." The analysts later concluded, without the 330 seconds protection, the entire bomber wing would have been annihilated. Word spread through the bomber groups. Crews began requesting the red tails by name. One navigator recalled, "When we saw those red tails behind us, we knew we'd get home." At first, most bomber crews didn't even realize their escorts were black. When they found out, disbelief turned into admiration. In war, color meant nothing. Performance meant survival. Between missions, life settled into rhythm. Pilots played cards, wrote letters, listened to swing music crackling through static. Ground crews worked endlessly, patching bullet holes, scavenging for parts from wrecked planes. Ramitelli was little more than dirt runways and canvas tents, but it became home. They called it Little Tuskegee. Every morning before takeoff, mechanics saluted their pilots, not as subordinates, but as brothers. They all knew how fragile the next few hours could be. By spring 1945, Germany was collapsing. But one threat remained, the Me-262 jet. Faster than any propeller plane, it could slice through bomber formations before escorts could react. On March 24th, the 332nd received its most dangerous assignment: escorting bombers to Berlin to strike the Daimler-Benz factory. 43 Mustangs, led by Davis, took off into the cold morning. At altitude, contrails twisted across the sky. Then the jets came, sleek, gray, and impossibly fast. But the red tails had studied them. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown saw a Me-262 break formation. He dove away, then turned sharply into its blind spot. "I pulled up in a 15-degree climb and fired 3 long bursts from 2,000 feet, he later recalled. The German pilot ejected seconds before his aircraft exploded. Moments later, Lieutenant Earl Lane performed an impossible deflection shot, striking another jet at 2,000 yards. A third Me-262 fell to Charles Brantley's guns. 3 German jets down in one engagement, more than any other fighter group achieved in the entire war. The Red Tails had proven again, discipline could defeat speed. By war's end, the numbers spoke for themselves. 15,000 combat sorties, 1,578 missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 destroyed on the ground. 27 bombers lost under their escort versus 46 average for other groups. And behind every statistic, there was cost. 66 pilots killed in action, 32 captured, 84 lost in training. But among bomber crews, a saying took root: if you have to go deep, pray for the red tails. May 1945, Germany surrendered. At Ramitelli, engines stopped. The airfield fell silent. Some men cheered. Others simply stood beside their planes, unsure what to feel. Davis looked toward the horizon and whispered, "No one needs to prove anything anymore." For the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile, briefly. When they returned to America, the welcome was cold. Segregated ports, divided lines, signs reading "White officers left, colored right." They had fought to defend democracy, yet could not share the same dining hall. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown wrote later, "We won the war abroad, but we had another waiting for us at home." The 332nd's discipline and record became evidence in a different battle: the fight for equality. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, integrating the U.S. military. Historians would later write that without the Red Tails' example, that order might never have existed. Their courage in the sky became a weapon against prejudice on the ground. As the sun sets over the Adriatic, red tails glint against fading light. Engines idle, then fade. A single narrator voice steady. They began as an experiment. They ended as proof. The war had turned. Italy was in Allied hands, but the battle for Europe continued. For the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, every dawn began with the same ritual: engine checks, maps spread on tables, and a roll call of names that grew shorter each week. They had become an elite unit, yet each mission was a reminder of how fragile life in the air could be. When a pilot did not return, his name was crossed out on a metal board by the runway. No ceremony, no announcement, just silence. August 12th, 1944. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson of Detroit led a reconnaissance flight over southern France. His P-51 was hit by anti-aircraft fire while strafing a German radar site. Flames spread across the left wing. He bailed out at 12,000 feet. Captured hours later, Jefferson was interrogated by German intelligence. The officer addressing him read from a file containing his parents' names and address in Detroit. Jefferson was stunned. The enemy knew more about him than his own command. He was sent to Stalag Luft 3, a camp for Allied airmen. There he discovered a different reality. Captured bomber crews recognized his unit immediately. One pilot shook his hand and said, "You were the ones who stayed with us." Inside a Nazi camp, Jefferson was treated as a soldier. Back home, he knew he would not be. At Ramitelli, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. maintained discipline with unbreakable precision. He forbade morning rituals. Pilots were to fly the next day, no exceptions. He believed grief was a luxury his men could not afford. To outsiders, he appeared cold. But to those who served under him, his silence was a shield against collapse. Every mission report he signed ended with 2 words: continue operations. When night fell, pilots drank coffee from tin mugs and listened to faint jazz from Chicago. They rarely spoke of fear. Instead, they talked about home. Streets they hadn't seen in years. Letters that never arrived. The mechanics worked through the night. They had no spare parts, no proper tools, but their aircraft readiness rate matched the best units in Europe. Many slept on the ground beneath the planes they kept alive. Racial barriers did not vanish in Italy. At shared bases, black and white units ate in separate areas. Some officers still used slurs openly. Colonel Davis never responded. He simply outperformed them. Each successful escort mission was a statement. Each bomber that returned was an argument won without words. Training at Tuskegee had taught them discipline as a form of faith. They had flown 300 hours before graduation, 100 more than white cadets. 60% had washed out. Those who remained called themselves the 60% who would not quit. That discipline followed them into combat. It became their advantage over an enemy who relied on numbers and rage. For every pilot lost, a telegram arrived back home. A yellow envelope marked missing in action. Mothers wept in silence because their sons' stories were rarely printed in mainstream papers. The Army's Public Information Office issued few releases about black units. Most citizens never knew that the best escort record in the 15th Air Force belonged to them. Combat fatigue spread quietly through the camp. Some men developed tremors. Others stopped talking entirely. There was no word for post-traumatic stress yet, only the term battle exhaustion. A pilot wrote in his journal, "We don't fear death anymore. We fear forgetting why we're still alive." He tore the page out and burned it. When lists of aces were published, few black names appeared. Lee Archer had 4 confirmed kills, possibly 5, but official records listed only 4. Even success was filtered through skepticism. Archer later said, "No one believed a black fighter pilot could be an ace, so they made sure none of us were." March 24, 1944, a German bombing raid struck Ramitelli. Fuel trucks ignited and storage tanks exploded. Several ground crew were killed. Others dragged burning planes away from the flames barehanded. When it was over, the survivors went back to work. The next morning, every aircraft was ready to fly. Despite rigid hierarchies, a bond formed between pilots and mechanics. They trusted each other absolutely. A mechanic once said, "If a plane didn't come back, I wondered if it was something I missed." That sense of responsibility made the 330 seconds maintenance record one of the highest in the Air Force. By late 1944, the unit's success was statistically undeniable, but public acknowledgement remained scarce. The War Department feared controversy. Inside the camp, the men felt the contradiction deeply. They had won respect from the enemy, but not from their own country. When Allied forces liberated Stalag Luft 3 in April 1945, Jefferson and other POWs were flown to France. During debriefing, they were treated like any other airmen. But on re-entry to the United States, segregation resumed immediately. Jefferson wrote later, "In Germany, I was a prisoner. In America, I was a problem." Colonel Davis rarely spoke about discrimination during the war. He believed results were the only argument worth making. His silence was not submission, it was strategy. When asked years later how he endured, he answered simply, "By doing my job better than anyone else." 66 pilots were killed in combat. 84 more died in training or non-combat missions. Each loss was a void that no medal could fill. Their families received standard condolence letters, identical paragraphs, different names. The nation moved on. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the enemy was not just the Luftwaffe. It was the idea that they did not belong. Every mission they flew was both combat and argument. Every landing proved a principle. Competence has no color. By the final months of 1945, the 332nd was one of the most decorated groups in the theater. Their record forced the U.S. military to re-examine its own assumptions. But for the men on the ground, recognition was a distant concept. They had survived the war. The question was whether their country would survive its own prejudice. As the guns fell silent across Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen faced their second battle, the long one at home. They had endured bombs, bullets, and doubt. Now they would endure forgetfulness. But history would not forget forever. Because buried inside every combat report, every disciplinary record, every photo of a red-tailed plane was proof of something greater than victory. The simple truth that they had done their duty when no one expected them to. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. But for the 332nd Fighter Group, there were still missions to fly, bombers to protect, and losses to bear. Germany was collapsing from within. Rail lines lay twisted across the countryside. Cities were smoking ruins. Yet in the air, the Luftwaffe continued to fight with the desperation of a dying regime. The Red Tails, as the bomber crews now called them, flew deep into the heart of the Reich. Berlin, Munich, Regensburg, Linz. Every flight meant 7 hours in the cockpit, through freezing altitudes, through flak and fighters, through exhaustion that could outlast courage. They were still the only black fighter group in the U.S. Army Air Forces. And every victory remained a quiet challenge to an institution that had never believed they could exist. In March 1945, Germany unveiled its last weapon, the Messerschmitt Me 262. It was the world's first operational jet fighter. Faster than anything in the sky, it could outrun the P-51 Mustang by over 100 miles per hour. The 332nd's orders were clear: escort the bombers to Berlin, destroy any jets encountered. On March 24th, they took off from Ramitelli at dawn. 43 Mustangs against a sky full of uncertainty. Over the German capital, the air shimmered with contrails. Then came the jets, silver, sleek, and lethal. But Lieutenant Roscoe Brown had studied their weakness: slow acceleration at low altitude, vulnerable during turns. He baited one, climbed at a 15-degree angle, and opened fire at 2,000 feet. The jet burst into flames. Moments later, another fell to Lieutenant Earl Lane. A third was destroyed by Charles Brantley. 3 German jets, gone in a single day. More than most Allied groups had ever claimed in the entire war. The 332nd earned a Distinguished Unit Citation for that mission. Their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., wrote in his logbook, "Target, Berlin. Escort, successful. Jets destroyed, 3. Losses, minimal." Nothing more. No emotion, no celebration. For Davis, the numbers spoke enough. By April, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself. Fuel shortages grounded hundreds of aircraft. Veteran pilots were gone, replaced by teenagers. The skies that once burned with dogfights were now ruled by silence. The Red Tails continued to fly. Not because they had to, but because every mission still meant proof. Proof that they were equal to any man who took to the air. Over Vienna and Linz, they strafed rail yards and convoys. They hit locomotives, trucks, and tanks trying to escape the encircling Allied lines. In 1 month alone, they destroyed over 100 ground targets. When the final surrender came in May, they were still flying, still in formation, still red against the sky. The war ended quietly for them. No parades, no fanfare, no front-page headlines. At Ramitelli, pilots sat by their planes in the evening light. Some played cards, some stared at the horizon. They had done their duty. 179 bomber escort missions, 1,578 combat sorties, 112 aerial victories. And yet, few outside the 15th Air Force even knew their name. Their record was impeccable: 27 bombers lost under their protection, Compared to 46, the average for other groups, they had proved themselves beyond any possible doubt. But recognition would take decades. When the men returned to America, they came home to segregation. White pilots were greeted with parades, medals, and offers of airline careers. The red tails were separated at disembarkation points directed to colored waiting areas. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson, recently freed from a German prison camp, found that equality existed only behind enemy lines. He wrote later, "In Germany, I was a prisoner. In America, I was a problem." Many returned to small towns and factory jobs. Few spoke about the war. To talk about it was to remember too much, and to explain the silence of a nation that pretended they had not fought at all. History would eventually preserve their numbers: 15,000 sorties, 179 escort missions, 112 aerial victories, 96 distinguished flying crosses, 744 air medals, 14 bronze stars, 8 Purple Hearts, 14 unit citations, 66 pilots killed in action, 84 in training, 32 captured. Every statistic recorded in black ink on white paper, but the color that mattered most had been painted on their tails: crimson red, the mark of endurance. After the war, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen faded into obscurity. The military maintained segregation. Public schools did not teach their history. For 2 decades, they remained an invisible chapter of American victory. Lee Archer, one of their top aces, took a job in business. He rarely mentioned his service. When asked why, he said, "Nobody believed me anyway." Colonel Davis continued his career in silence, methodically climbing the ranks of a system that had once rejected him. In 1954, he became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. It took 13 more years for the military he served to honor what he had built. For historians, the hardest battle was documentation. Reports were buried, misfiled, or classified. Only fragments of film existed. It was as if their legacy had been deliberately erased. But veterans preserved the truth through reunion groups and oral histories. They gathered in small halls, shared photographs, and spoke the names of those who had not returned. Over time, journalists and archivists rediscovered their story. The numbers could not be denied. 112 German aircraft destroyed, 3 jet fighters downed in a single day, a bomber protection record that surpassed every other group. The evidence forced acknowledgement, not as charity, but as fact. In 2007, more than 60 years after their first mission, President George W. Bush awarded the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal. Only 300 of them were still alive to attend. They sat in the Capitol Rotunda, old men in dark suits, their medals reflecting the light of television cameras. Reporters asked how it felt to finally be recognized. One veteran replied softly, "We were never fighting for medals. We were fighting for the right to fight." The applause that followed was respectful, but brief. Then the room emptied, leaving behind the echo of history finally spoken aloud. Today, the name Red Tails carries more than memory. It symbolizes proof. Proof that excellence can emerge under pressure, that courage can exist in silence, and that skill has no color but precision. The Tuskegee Airmen became instructors, engineers, and leaders. Their discipline shaped the integrated Air Force that followed. Their record remains untouched in American aviation history. Each time a modern fighter jet roars into the sky, its lineage traces back to those red-tailed Mustangs that flew across Europe when the world was on fire. In recent years, the last surviving pilots have grown old. Their voices tremble when they recall the smell of oil and dust, the weight of helmets, the silence between missions. When asked what they remember most, they do not mention combat. They speak of the sound of engines starting at dawn, of friendship and of pride held quietly inside. One veteran said, "We didn't just change history. We changed what history was allowed to remember." The Tuskegee Airmen fought 3 wars, one against the Luftwaffe, one against Nazi ideology, and one against the prejudice of their own nation. They won all 3. Their story remains not just one of victory, but of endurance. The endurance to serve a country that did not yet know how to serve them in return. In the end, the color of their planes became the color of their legacy. Red for courage, for discipline, for proof written in sky and sacrifice.